Hello everyone, this is my first video in the series where I'm explaining the concepts that you've read in The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. And I'm going to be hitting the high points and kind of helping reinforce some of these concepts and making them more relevant to web design. So let's get right to it. So the big focus of Chapter 1 really is to introduce human-centered design. And what human-centered design essentially means is that you are designing things with the user in mind, with the idea that you are making something for a real person and you're trying to meet his or her needs in your design, which is something that a lot of web designers can get caught up in from time to time. We might try to design things for ourselves or make things look a certain way because that's how we like it, but we kind of forget the needs of our users in that way. So we have to remember human-centered design. One of the best examples for human-centered design is actually the picture that's on the front of your book. You're probably all familiar with this teapot with the handle on the wrong side by now. And the idea here is that this is not human-centered design. This takes into no account how a human would actually use this teapot. You have the handle and the spout on the same side, which is going to make it incredibly difficult for somebody to utilize to pour tea out of it. So for human-centered design, you have to have an understanding of how a human would interact with things and make decisions for your design based on that. And one of the ways we do that is by understanding the system image. Now, the system image is the visual part of a system that's being used. I mean, think about logging into a website. What if you went to a website, you knew you were supposed to log into it, but you couldn't find the button where you needed to go to log in? The fact that that button is not there is representative of an incomplete system image. The system image is the visual part of the system being used. So if it's incomplete, if you're missing something, or if it's confusing, then the system image is bad and the user is not able to interact with the website or the item or whatever you have in the way that they should. Let's look at this example. Here's a thing. What is this? You're probably looking at this thing right now thinking, I have no idea what this is. It looks like a spaceship. You might think like you use those spiky bits to maybe stab somebody. And I mean, this is a prime example of a confusing system image. Like you're getting the entire visual of the system, but you have no idea of how to actually use it. Now, when we put it into context, it's understandable. It's a juicer. You got the fruit in half, you juice it on top. The juice goes through the channels and funnels down to the point at the bottom where it goes into your glass. But on its own, it's missing the affordances and signifiers that would make it a complete system image that is rational. If you were just given this juicer out of the box, unwrapped, with no explanation as to what it was, the system image would have you so, you're confused. You have no idea what to do. So that's where we employ the fundamental principles of interaction. And we're going to talk briefly about the fundamental principles of interaction. Some of them we'll talk more about in depth later. Affordances. Affordances is one of those that we'll talk more about in depth later. But it's essentially the fact that something looks like it's able to do something. Signifiers are another one that we'll talk more in depth about later. A signifier is a direct call regarding an action. So like if you see a link and it has a little label beside it that says click this link, that's a signifier. Constraints. So we looked at constraints a little bit in Module 1. Constraints come in all shapes and sizes. They're the things that stand in your way from, being able to kind of meet your goals. But within constraints is where creativity really comes to play, because by working with or around constraints to still be able to meet your goal requires real creative thinking to be able to do things. The next one is mapping. So with mapping, you're putting things in an order relationally. With how we read from the top of the page to the bottom of the page and across the page. Left to right. Our left to our right. As we're facing something. So when we're thinking about mapping content on a website, where then should we put the most important content versus the least important content? Well, the most important content would need to go somewhere where the eye would see it first. So your eye is going to naturally gravitate to the top left-hand portion of the page because that's where the user is used to starting to read. So your most important information, the stuff that you want to make sure that they read, should go there. The least important information should go in the opposite corner because that's where you finish reading, down in the bottom right. The book uses the example of lights and light switches in a theater, and how the light switches on the wall should be mapped to reflect the row of lights or what have you that they control. If light switch 1 turned off row of lights 3, that would make things incredibly confusing. So you want to make sure you're mapping things and putting them in a rational order as you're creating a design. Feedback. So feedback is another thing that goes along with affordances and signifiers. Where affordances and signifiers are input functions, feedback is an output function. So with feedback, you're just letting your user know that they did something right or wrong. If you've ever used a website, you log in. If you log in successfully, you'll get a screen that says, congratulations, you're logged in, proceed to your account or whatever. And if you got your password wrong, it'll come up with a big red box that says, password incorrect, please try again. Both of those are examples of feedback. They let the user know that the action that they made did something, and it indicates as to what their next steps are. And we'll discuss feedback a little more in depth later on in the course. The conceptual model, and we'll wrap up with this. So the conceptual model is just how you think something might work. And this is where these affordances and signifiers and mapping and feedback and all of that comes into play. Because, if you think back to that teapot that we saw, the teapot that's on the front of your book, you immediately come up with a conceptual model as to how that teapot is supposed to be used based on the affordances present with the teapot. You think, well, there's a handle there that gives me the affordance of a place to hold it. There's a spout that gives me the affordance of a place to pour things out. There's a larger top area under the lid that seems to be an affordance of where to put things in. So I should put my water and my tea bags in the top, hold it by the handle, and somehow pour it backhanded into my mug. And that's creating a conceptual model. If you think back to the example that we gave when we were looking at the system image, since the system image was incomplete, you couldn't come up with a conceptual model. You had no idea what this thing was used for, because there weren't any clear affordances. There weren't any clear signifiers. So you couldn't adequately come up with a conceptual model. So you have to think about, when a user is going to your website, how this user would approach the website conceptually. And we can actually get this information directly from the user if we utilize things like A/B testing and focus grouping and things of that nature, where we're actually talking to our users and getting them to tell us what their conceptual model was, not in so many terms. Because remember, we have to use user language when we're surveying and interviewing users. But we can get them to tell us what their conceptual model was and what we can do to get closer to having their conceptual model match the intended function. Whether that means making more affordances and signifiers that make things more clear, or making your website work more how they think it should work. So those are the high points of Chapter 1. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you for listening.